Namaskar and good afternoon to speakers of the day and all our guests watching this online. The Consulate General of India in Cape Town, in association with High Commission of India at Pretoria and our consulates in Johannesburg and Durban, is glad to organize this webinar titled India's Journey of 75 Years, Perspectives from South Africa. This is being held as a component of Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav Week to celebrate 75 years of India's independence in various locations in South Africa. We all are aware that father of our nation, Mahatma Gandhi, developed his principles of peace and non-violence in this country. As a fitting tribute to that, we started this iconic week with an event at Tolstoy Farm on the 2nd of October. In this program today, we are hosting 3 speakers in hybrid mode. Mr. Aziz Hartley and Mr. Nirode Bramdaw are at Cape Town, and Mr. Jaideep Sarkar, the High Commissioner of India to South Africa, is joining us virtually from Pretoria. I also have the pleasure of having our colleagues, Consul General of Johannesburg, Mrs. Anju Ranjan, and Consul General of India in Durban, Mr. Anish Rajan. Now, I would like to introduce the first speaker of the day, Mr. Aziz Hartley. Mr. Hartley is a resident of Cape Town. He has studied at Cape Peninsula University of Technology and Institute for the Advancement of Journalism. He was deeply involved in the trade union movement during the 1980s and served as a provincial chairperson of Media Workers Association of South Africa. And later, he was at the union's national executive as its deputy president. He was also actively involved in the campaigns of the Congress of South Africa Trade Unions and National Council of Trade Unions. In his media career, he occupied various positions in Cape Times and later was appointed as its deputy editor. He is presently the executive editor of the Cape Argus. Now, I would welcome and invite Mr. Aziz to give a speech.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you, Consul General Ashok Babu. It's indeed a very good, great pleasure for me to be here. I greet Mr. Bramdaw, and I also greet our other colleague in Pretoria. As I say, it's a real honor for me to be addressing you during this auspicious occasion. And I must say that when the Consul General approached me about coming to speak at this event, I confess to being not sufficiently qualified to do so. You know, it's one thing to be writing, it's another thing to be speaking. And I must say, I was really truly humbled by having received the invite to be able to make a contribution, although it's a very tiny one. Let me start by saying that in celebrating the anniversary of a very great leader, Mohandas Karamchand Gandhi, you can't discount the enormity of this occasion. And while it gives us an opportunity to reflect on his immense contribution that he made in the fight against oppression, colonialism, racism, and so on, I felt that it is perhaps a good chance for us to consider today how we, 70 years after his brutal taking away, how we can build on this great legacy. Last Friday, the Cape Argus on its world page had a quote, and it read like this: I object to violence because when it appears to do good, that good is only temporary. The evil it does is permanent. And that was a quote by Mahatma Gandhi. And I pondered over this for a while, and I thought, you know what? What is the significance of this quote? What is the significance of such a short statement? And we know that Gandhi can be seen as, by this very statement he makes, as in essence a man of peace. Being someone of peace in a cruel and violent world, it takes a lot of courage because you are up against the odds all the time. And one has to be brave and strong to be stooping or to avoid stooping to the level of those whose response to truth is to be violent. And we've seen this all over the world. We've seen this with great leaders like Gandhi. So what is the relevance with Mahatma Gandhi and our very own here in South Africa? I'll get to that in a minute. It is therefore quite telling that as you mark the anniversary of this great man, it comes at a time where there is so much violence and conflict and unrest and strife in this world. And this violence manifests itself in so many forms, physical and subtle. We have widespread poverty, and one has to say that poverty is one form of violence. There's no dignity in begging. There's also the long-term effects of the violence of colonialism. And we see what's happening today. South Africa is still struggling to shed the effects of colonialism. We talk about inequality, unemployment, racism, oppression, discrimination, and the abuse of power. Those are all forms of violence. And they have to be confronted. And all of them has what Gandhi says, it has a permanency to it. The evil they do is permanent. And there seems to be no end in sight of these forms of violence wherever they appear. And where they appear to be good, but that good is temporary, as Gandhi rightly states. Another form of violence are the acts of genocide and war. And all the peace work that is being done by individuals and organizations across the world is being made very difficult, because how do you establish peace when there are so many vested interests in war? How do you silence the guns when there are people's livelihoods that depend on making war? How do you stop a war when there are people whose careers are built on making war? How do you stop a war when part of a country's economy depends on the manufacturing of weapons, and where the arms industry is so lucrative? So what it effectively means is that the challenge of world peace is a very difficult one. And the world leaders can do very well by heavily investing in peace and nonviolence. The signing of peace pacts are only as good as the paper they're written on. If they can't be backed up by tangible and visible actions. And the good that can come from that will be permanent. As we know, Gandhi was a man of peace, and he used non-violence as a means of resisting a system that was deeply violent. Like our very own beloved Nelson Mandela. Both were people of peace. And like Gandhi, Mandela preached nonviolence in dealing with the vicious and the vicious and violent system of oppression, of racism and apartheid. Mandela's resorting to taking up of arms was only a last way. There was no other way. Other ways have been tried and they failed. But it was a sacrifice worth paying for the freedom we have as South Africans today. And likewise, the freedom the people of India enjoy today are due to Gandhi's vision and leadership. Likewise, the freedom we have was due to the vision and leadership of Mandela. And these two great individuals, ironically both lawyers, they made an immense contribution to some little bit of peace we have in the world today. And they made a huge contribution to, in some way, make the world a better place. And the violence that's happening before our eyes, where women and children are the main victims, it also reflects the chronic deficit of good leadership we have in the world today. It proves a lack of patience, tolerance, a humanity, and a longing for true peace. And these are the values both Gandhi and Mandela cherished. And if these values at the present, they present what I call the umbilical cord that ties India and South Africa. And at a time where there's so much strife and conflict, we can do what leaders like Mandela and Gandhi. So the challenge for us is, or if we respect, or if we claim to treasure the legacies of these two giants, the challenge for us is to spread the message of peace, equality, freedom, and the value for human life. And we must spread this to all those we interact with on a daily basis. This would be a true tribute to them. And this would make us think and make us say, like Gandhi said, he objects to violence because when it appears good, that good is only temporary. So our objective must be, as we celebrate this occasion, to strive for peace, to do what we can to treasure the legacies of peace of these two giants. Thank you.
Thanks for your remarks, Aziz. It was a thought-provoking speech. Now, I would like to invite the second speaker, Mr. Nirode Bramdaw. I'll introduce him first. Mr. Bramdaw is a resident of Durban and hails from a publishing background. His family owned The Leader, one of South Africa's first black entities in this sector. He served the publication for more than 12 years in the capacity of managing editor. As a writer, he has co-edited and has contributed to many journals like the Africa Quarterly and wrote regular columns for the Sunday Times and the Business Day. He currently writes opinion columns for the Natal Mercury. From 2004 to 8, as a volunteer, he worked directly with President Thabo Mbeki and Minister in the Presidency, Dr. Eso Pahad, in strategy development. Mr. Bramdaw was a member of the India South Africa CEOs Forum, which was co-chaired by South Africa's Patrice Motsepe and India's Ratan Tata. Since 2015, he is on the board of the 1860 Heritage Center, a South African museum which showcases the rich heritage of Indian South Africans. Mr. Bramdaw is also the Honorary Consul of the Republic of Mauritius in KwaZulu-Natal since 2008. On his personal front, he is an avid hiker, runner, and a golf enthusiast. I welcome him to deliver his speech.
Thank you very much, Master of Ceremonies. I will come back to my colleague Aziz Hartley's thought-provoking input towards the end of mine. But greetings to His Excellency Shri Jaideep Sarkar, His Excellency Shri Ashok Babu, fellow panelist Aziz Hartley, friends, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to preface my remarks by first congratulating the world's largest democracy on its attainment of its 75th anniversary of independence. South Africa and India have been inextricably linked for the better part of 350 years. Unfortunately, the relationship between India and South Africa took root with the early slave trade by the Dutch East India Company and the Western Cape. It was the Western Cape's second and long-standing governor, Simon van der Stel, who provided another link. His grandmother was Monica of Goa, making van der Stel the first mixed-race governor of the Western Cape. Bringing this relationship to its present day, indulge me as I read an extract from President Cyril Ramaphosa, who was the chief guest at India's Republic Day celebrations in New Delhi in 2019. The South African Indian community played a formative role in the freedom struggle, and after apartheid ended, in the reconstruction of a new South Africa. We remember these great leaders, Yusuf Dadoo, Monty Naika, Fatima and Ismail Mir, Lalu Chiba, Bani Desai, Ahmed Timol, Ismail Mohammed, Amina Desai, Billy Naya, Yusuf Kachalia, Ahmed Kathrada, and many others who will forever be remembered for their contribution to the liberation struggle. The South African Indian community produced outstanding activists and cadres who today serve with distinction in our government. Mahatma Gandhi's granddaughter, Ila Gandhi, played a leading role in the women's movement in South Africa and was amongst the first group of MPs of the new South Africa. These were all leaders of conviction and of principle. They were unwavering in their belief in the unity of all the oppressed and stood firmly against the attempts by the racist apartheid state to divide our people along ethnic and tribal lines. They believed, as it has been the founding principle of the African National Congress, that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. Mr. Sarkar, you'll agree with me that your posting is a vital one in India's foreign affairs imperatives and its Africa agenda. Unlike other countries, South Africa is blessed with a strong Indian community that have firmly made South Africa their home, assimilating completely into the local social, political, and economic fabric. The South African Indian community, who were first brought to the country as slaves and then as indentured labor in 1860, have a vibrant culture, tradition, and values that has added to the rich tapestry that is our multicultural society. Many of these men, women, and children who came in search of a better life were subject to harsh and inhumane conditions on the sugar plantations. After serving their indentures, a large percentage returned to India. But many others stayed and made South Africa their new home. India must capitalize on this strong Indian community and advancing its objectives. In closing my short address, I would like to share some glowing examples of India's commitment to South Africa's liberation, as shared with me personally by the late Ahmed Kathrada. India's role at the United Nations by Mrs. Vijaya Lakshmi Pandit and Mr. Enuga Reddy is well documented. In 1946, India was the first country to impose trade, economic, and cultural sanctions on South Africa. The ANC office in New Delhi received unstinting support from the Indian government, which awarded it diplomatic status. It is a little-known fact that India funded the ANC's acquisition of its headquarters, Luthuli House, in 1994. In 1960, when ANC leaders Oliver Tambo, Dr. Yusuf Dadoo, Moses Kotane, and Maulvi Kachalya left the country without passports, it was India that was the first country to provide them with travel documents. Imagine the fact that the Johannesburg International Airport is named after an African leader that held an Indian passport. There are Moses Kotane streets in Durban, Johannesburg, and Pretoria. The main thoroughfare through Durban is named after Dr. Yusuf Dadu. This heritage speaks to the fact that India played no small role in South Africa attaining democracy. Despite being the years of the struggle, the bilateral relationship was very strong under apartheid. Following the attainment of democracy, one of President Mandela's first official state visits was to India, a trip I was fortunate to have accompanied him on. The subsequent signing of the Red Fort Declaration and other bilateral agreements have been concluded and remain in effect. The years immediately after democracy in South Africa, I would deem the halcyon days of the bilateral relationship between our two nations, with Mandela and John T. Rhodes winning the hearts and minds of the Indian nation. With those few words, I'd like to welcome some interaction with our audiences, physical and virtual. But I'd like to respond before I leave the podium to Aziz's remarks, because we were just lamenting the fact earlier before this webinar started that there was a very brutal, violent incident at Cape Town's top beaches. And I think that as society, we need to inculcate that peaceful message that Gandhi stood for, and perhaps engage as peace activists on the flats and wherever, because intimacy and violence in the Western Cape is a problem. And maybe today we can draw on those lessons from Gandhi and make this community much more peaceful so that they could thrive out of the poverty that they find themselves in. I thank you.
Thanks, Mr. Bramdaw. Now I welcome and request the High Commissioner to give his remarks and moderate the Q&A session. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And let me extend my own welcome to the two distinguished speakers, Aziz Hartley and Nirode Bramdaw. To begin with, I think Aziz, we kept the subject of this seminar a little broad so that we could leave it to people to discuss what they felt about this subject, about India and South Africa, the enterprise of nation building in both countries. And I think what struck Aziz Hartley from all this was the statement of Gandhiji about good being temporary and evil being permanent. And he defined various aspects of violence, poverty, colonialism, inequality, racism, oppression, and so on and so forth. And he referred to how both Gandhi as well as Madiba were men of peace, and their answer to these problems was to adopt non-violent and peaceful means. But I would like to start this Q&A and this discussion by asking Aziz Hartley, the values that he spoke about, which were propagated by Gandhi as well as Madiba, are some values universal to mankind, or do they die with each generation? Aziz Hartley, please.
Hello, yes, thank you, High Commissioner, for the question. Each generation brings their own principles, their own values, their own ways, their own manners. The young people we have today are not the same of the young people of my generation or before mine. But there are commonalities in each generation irrespective. And firstly, it's the one of the value of life. Everybody treasures life. And that can be proven that even the most bravest person, when he or she is confronted by death, he or she portrays the value of life, meaning that he or she wants to continue living. So that is one commonality in all humans. The other commonality is the one of peace, that you feel better. Even if you're a violent person, you feel better if you are at peace with yourself or with those around you, even at peace with your enemies. So those are values that are universal. But as I say, each generation comes with their own values and it gets added, but over the long run, in generations, the value of peace, it's diluted as we go along. The type of violence we see today is so brutal that we've almost become insensitized to it, that it no longer stirs us to see somebody shot to death, because we've become so accustomed to seeing those scenes. I'm hoping that answers your question. Thanks.
Yes, I think that we can all certainly agree with you that there are certain human values that are universal, that are passed on from generation to generation, and are perhaps inherent in the DNA of humans. But at the same time, reflecting on your answer, Gandhiji used non-violence to bring India freedom. Madiba used different techniques to liberate his own homeland. And therefore, they were successful in their struggles, at least to give freedom to their people. But in your talk, you did speak about poverty, as I mentioned, colonialism, inequality, racism, oppression. Now, these are probably the tasks of our and the succeeding generations. And therefore, the challenge for our intellectuals, for our leaders, for our thinkers, and for our philosophers is really to find ways of adopting the values and the techniques that were bequeathed to us by these great leaders to deal with the problems of today. And that's certainly not, that's no mean task. I think that what actually is happening very often, as we can see, and which you mentioned, and in which, in fact, Nirode Bramdaw also spoke about an incident recently, is too often these problems that you referred to, inequality, racism, and poverty, actually lead to violence. And somehow we are not able to solve these problems through non-violent approaches. If I were to move on to what Nirode Bramdaw spoke, I think he, from his perspective, he spoke about the contributions of the Indian community to the freedom struggle in South Africa, and how India and South Africa were, in a sense, joined together during the period of apartheid. And indeed, I think even before, I have read Madiba's book, and he says he's written quite extensively in his book and also in speeches that he gave after coming out of prison, about the influence that Gandhi's ideas, his values had on the freedom struggle in South Africa. And I think you're right that he himself writes that we initially started by adopting non-violent techniques, but we found that it came to a point where we had to use violent approaches as a last resort. So he explained, in fact, why he was using violence without at all giving up the creed of non-violence. It's just that within a in a specific situation, he felt the need to use violence as a last resort. But I would like to ask you, Mr. Bramdaw, you mentioned the contributions of the Indian community. You mentioned the great leaders who were part and parcel of the freedom struggle, and also the help that India gave. And I ask this question because, in a sense, if I look at the journey of 75 years of India's history, it's a great milestone in the history of any country. We can't disassociate our own history from the history of our diaspora. The diaspora has played its own very important role in the history of India. And you referred, of course, to the very strong links that the Indian diaspora had with India during this period. But if I were to move on a little bit, and I would like to know from you, where do we go from here? The Indian community, there are two aspects. Where do you see the Indian community going? So number one, what challenges does the community face going ahead in the future of South Africa? And how do we strengthen the links that the Indian diaspora has with India? Certainly, those links have to be strengthened to allow people to trace their roots, to nourish their identities, to learn about their history, their past, and so on. But can it be more practical? Could we involve the Indian community in South Africa, which is a well-settled community, to engage us more in our respective nation-building enterprises through business, in academia, through different forms of interaction. So I'd like you to reflect on both these aspects. What are the challenges within South Africa? How do you see the Indian community evolving in the future? And what is it that we can do together? Mr. Bramdaw.
Yeah, I think that being a former activist, I'm quite disappointed in the way political leadership in South Africa has evolved. We all fought for non-racialism, and sadly that non-racialism doesn't exist anymore with the majority party and with certain other ones. And this is something that we collectively fought for. That was all colors, the Indians, whites, coloreds, Malays, everybody fought for that non-racial democracy. And today we are becoming polarized as society. I think we need to reinculcate the fact that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, black and white. And I think that racial disharmony needs to be addressed. I feel it here in the Western Cape, and I felt it very strongly in Durban, that there have been polarizations of communities along race lines. And that's something we must guard against, and that's something we must constantly battle with. One of the things of repeating myself on the role that the different communities played in the struggle is for that very fact, that we fought for a non-racial democracy, but what we've landed up with is a polarized society. I think that's where we've gone wrong as contemporary leadership in South Africa. I think for engagement going forward, I like the way in which your mission and its Cape Town and Durban offices are very non-racial for perhaps their selection of bursary students to travel to India. And they promote interracial harmony by choosing those students of color that want to go. And I think that's a very concrete way of exposing African South Africa to the role that India played, and perhaps through that. But in terms of more meaningful engagement, I'll come back to my friend Aziz's comment that maybe we should develop, the Faculty of Peace Studies should come up with a cohort of peace activists that go out into the community and try and resolve conflict and see how they could spread this message. That's one of the ways I think it would work. Because if you see what happened in Durban recently and in Johannesburg, we are polarized, and we need to guard against that polarization every step of the way and every commentary we make. I think that's an important thing. And India has been doing a yeoman role in playing that part, in saying that, look, it's not all about the Indian community. We have a bilateral relationship that includes the whole of South Africa. I think that's an important aspect.
Sir, you are muted, sir. We can't hear you.
I'm sorry, I forgot to unmute it. I was just saying that I think the point you referred to about polarization and division, this unfortunately is a contemporary reality. And if you look at even the most developed countries in the world, in the Western world, they are also facing issues of division, of polarization, of partisanship, and so on. So I think it's a real challenge in all countries to unite people behind a common platform, a common nationhood. But if I were to just move on a little bit, and I'd like to just come back to Aziz Hartley and how a key issue in all the points that you have raised, particularly what Nirode Bramdaw also said just now, both in India, in South Africa, and in fact, all democracies, particularly in the world, the role of the media is critical to influencing public opinion. And now we have, along with the traditional media, you have the social media and so on. So I'd like you to reflect, Aziz, a little bit on does the media self-introspect as to the role that it is playing? Is it something that engages your attention? I mean, the social media or even print media, how you portray certain events and so on. Is there a discussion within the media as to what role it should play in kind of addressing some of the issues that both of you raised? What is the perspective from the media's point of view?
Yes, thank you for that question. Look, from where we sit as the media, and I'm talking about mainstream media, we are guided by a few principles. One main principle is to hear the other side of the story. That to give the person who doesn't have a voice, give that person a voice. The other principle is to be objective. And the third principle is to make sure that when we report, that we do so in a way that it enhances democracy, it enhances social cohesion, and it enhances the fact that instead of inflaming a situation, that we help neutralize it. Those are just a few principles. The other thing that the mainstream media, of course, we have conversations amongst ourselves as to how big a role we play in contributing to the welfare of this country, to the welfare of society as a whole. And in doing so, we battle with, for example, social media. Our big enemy is fake news because we end up spending resources undoing fake news where we could have used those resources to put out, news that people really want to see. So it is a battle out there. But in answer to your question, yes, we have a role to play. We are mindful of it. And we don't report, or we shouldn't report to push any type of agenda. I just want to digress for a minute, and I can speak from my own title. We take on all political parties equally. including the ANC. And in Cape Town, where the DA governs, we are very unpopular. And I like being in that position where all political parties don't like you very much, because that means you're in the right place as a journalist. So we are very mindful of our role. Thank you.
I think that it's a real challenge for the media in the kind of world that we live in today. And I mean, of course, one agrees with you that all points of view should be given due representation and due reflection. But I did also read an editor who said, when a journalist told him the same thing, that, look, I'm reporting the different points of view. And he said, it's not your job to reflect only the different points of view. You have to reflect the truth. Just because somebody has a point of view which is fake news doesn't mean you have to reflect it. So I think that this is in today's environment, it's a very tricky question. What kind of views you reflect, even though they may reflect a certain section of a party. Well, I wouldn't say it's a party, but a particular group. So it's certainly quite a difficult task. Let me now just open the floor to questions. I think Ashok wanted to ask a question. Ashok, would you like to ask a question? Please address it to one of the speakers.
I had one question for Mr. Bramdaw. He is coming from Durban, so that makes this question obviously directed at him. I am here for last 1 year, so I am a newcomer to South Africa. Before that, as you had said, our exposure to South Africa was more about cricket. Now that we have somebody having an Indian connection to lead the South African team, the world has changed a lot. So, from your point of view and your experience as a media person as well as a local businessman, what would you count as the most significant contributions of, say, South African Indians after the democratic transition?
I think without a doubt, the indelible mark in the attainment of liberation in South Africa, and I think this was duly noted in the selection of Nelson Mandela's first cabinet, where he had an inordinate amount of people of Indian origin that far outnumbered the size of the population of Indians in South Africa at the time. So I think, without a doubt, it would be political and liberation. On the sporting front, I must tell you that I quite enjoyed the resumption of ties and South Africa going and playing again on the world stage. And if I must confess, outside of South Africa, I'm a big fan of Sri Lanka. And whenever the two countries play, there's such a lovely camaraderie and gentlemanliness about the game that's so sorely lacking when South Africa plays Australia, for example. So I have a lot of respect for the way in which the game is played, especially between South Africa and Sri Lanka. There's a common mutual respect, and it's a wonder to watch. And I've watched them take on South Africa at Newlands and in Durban, and yeah, from that perspective, it's nice now that we have an Indian captain. I don't know whether it'd be a Test captain or a T20 captain, but it's great that people are being selected on their merits now. I think we've come over the transition. We've got, in terms of cricket, it's majority people of color now. I'm subject to correction, but our fast bowling attack is largely black, and our spin bowling attack is Indian, and I think for each of them to play to their strengths. I think but again, to answer your question, I think on liberation, the community has played well.
Ashok, I'm very happy that you asked this question about cricket. Nothing excites Indians and people in the subcontinent more than cricket and Bollywood. And in that respect, all Indians are very familiar. I mean, cricket is something that incites such deep passions, not only in India, but all the cricketing countries. And Indians are extremely familiar with the great cricketing stars of South Africa, Hashim Amla, Jonty Rhodes, Sean Pollock, and so many of them, Dale Steyn and others. But I don't know which among my speakers, the colleagues, who is interested in cricket, but a few months back, an Indian commentator, Harsha Bhogle, said that cricket is dying in South Africa. And I've been trying to ask people, is this really true? Would any of you like to say something on this? Is it true what he said, that cricket is dying in South Africa and rugby and football are, of course, they are the most popular sports, but youngsters who would otherwise sometime in the past pick up cricket are today are playing rugby and football.
If I could just make one comment before Aziz. He's more affair with contemporary sporting news, but I think sadly, on the cricket front, certainly, the level of corruption that has come into our administration has kind of stifled talent. And it doesn't only exist in cricket. I think our rugby unions as well, Aziz, have been guilty of corruption. And whole boards resigning and people coming in as temporary management of these sporting codes. But I just want to make that comment. Maybe, Aziz, you want to give it more horns.
Yeah, I'm not sure whether I can give a bit more form, but I can say that there are some sporting codes in South Africa that are undergoing a number of challenges. One being, the issue of not enough resources being brought into the grassroots elements of the sport. Cricket, I disagree. It's not dying in South Africa. It may be silent or a bit dormant now than compared to what it was like 5 years ago, but it's still very much alive. There are challenges, especially at grassroots level, and there are sort of a disquiet in some areas, especially amongst the local clubs, taking on the bigger unions and those in power. Corruption is also sort of reared its head in cricket, and we could see by the issue of the cricket SA boss who had to step aside, and the whole battle of who the leadership should be in cricket in South Africa. Rugby also has its problems. Thankfully, we were given a get out of jail card with the last Rugby World Cup. We won, but the rugby also has its problems more at the provincial level. But the sport is very much alive. There are issues, and they can be solved.
Okay, thank you. That's heartening for cricket fans. Any other questions? I open the floor. Anish, would you like to ask? Yes, please, Anju. From Johannesburg. Please ask.
Hello. Good afternoon to all the eminent speaker, and afternoon, sir. We have been listening to this India and South Africa's journey of independence, and then how Gandhi and Madiba changed the course of the fate of these two countries, and then we attained the independence. My question is a bit different. I am dealing commerce and in Nepal, and then I'm dealing commerce here. So my question is that when we attained the political freedom in both the countries, and then after the 1994, South Africa also became free. And then so aren't we expecting that more growth in the economic front? And then we are losing somewhere in the economic front, because when I see that there is not even a preferential trade agreement between the two countries, even after the passage of 25 years of independence of South Africa, whereas I see the growth vis-a-vis bilateral trade growth vis-a-vis China is growing, and they have an agreement, and then everything. I find it very, very difficult to place India in the market at the same place as it was in 1994. We have been replaced by the other Asian countries and then more often with China. I wanted the view of the two speakers and what is the reason, how we can go about it and how we can mend our ways, both India and South Africa.
Okay, thank you very much for that question. It's a very interesting observation. I must say that in '94, when trade relations resumed between the two countries, um, the level of entrepreneurship that India had far outweighed our own. So you had business people of color that never listed an entity trying to engage with the likes of a Mittal or a Tata. And that's quite another thing. But they did engage, and they did engage on the right levels with the kind of traditional white Afrikaner businesses that existed in South Africa. Uh, Furthermore, I think that there's a lot to be done in the small and medium sectors of the economy between the two countries. On the smaller side, we've only seen very little kind of interaction in terms of imports of spices or clothing and things like that. But there are many other levels that one can engage. And I think maybe it's up to people like you who promote trade to say that we're looking for companies that deal in water pumps at this level or whatever the infrastructure requirements are in South Africa, identify them, prioritize them, but then also prioritize small and medium enterprises. I think we could see a lot more growth between the two countries, hopefully, if that happens. And it would be more meaningful an engagement than that exists with the other Eastern Bloc countries. Just my 2 cents. Aziz?
Yeah, I just want to make a minor contribution to answering that question, and that is perhaps the two countries should have more engagement via, the Department of Trade and Industry, and explore what other avenues are there to strengthen the economic ties. One can also maybe expand it out and do this via BRICS. And in that way, strengthen economic ties. We know that there are many South African businessmen of Indian origin that makes a massive contribution to the local economy. And we should hear their voices as well. What is it that they have to say? What can they contribute towards making economic ties stronger?
Thank you. I think one of the problems that I sense, whether it is in business, whether it is in the academic world, the scientific world, is that before 1994, we really didn't have any connections. Our institutions didn't have any connections. And the South Africa, during the apartheid period, was entirely focused towards the West. And therefore, they have old connections. Their companies, their universities, professors, scientists, all have connections with their Western counterparts. So I think this is something that I found it will probably take a little bit of time. But let me tell you something, that despite the pandemic, it's very interesting that India-South Africa trade actually increased during the last year. So that shows, in fact, the tremendous potential that exists and the growth that is possible in not only traditional sectors like commodities, but also in sectors like pharma, sectors like software, and so on. Moving on to one of the points that was raised, and I think this will probably have to be the last question. I just wanted to, you mentioned BRICS. So I just wanted to get a sense first from Aziz, Hartley, and then I'll come to a slightly different question. How does South Africa view BRICS? What do South African intellectuals think about South Africa's membership of BRICS, or what role BRICS could play in the world?
I'm not sure I have the answer to that question, but I'll venture one. I think a lot has to do with the local political setup in the country. We know that under the leadership of Thabo Mbeki, the take-up among the white business people in the country, the take-up wasn't that great. Neither under the Zuma administration. We have now President Ramaphosa who's trying to correct a few things, and he's very engaging with the local business community. So I think it remains to be seen what kind of attitude there would be now. More so that, our economy is a bit in the doldrums. So I just wanted to venture that short response.
Okay, maybe Mr. Bramdaw, would you like to add something to that?
Yes, I think I'd like to just add that if you look at the earlier relationships between firstly India and South Africa, in terms of India's opposition to apartheid at the United Nations, a lot of those anti-South African votes were supported by the likes of Russia. I think Russia was a close ally, second to India in our battles internationally. And then through the relationship with the Communist Party, China also had favored status with the liberation forces. So I think that BRICS, the way I view it, is that these are old allies that are all sitting in one trading bloc now, or diplomatic bloc, and that South Africa can play in that space with these people or these countries, nations that help them achieve their liberation. So that's the way I view it. I may be wrong, but if you look at the voting patterns at the UN, it was France, Mexico, India, Russia, China that were our big supporters in terms of moving votes against apartheid at the United Nations.
That's a very interesting perspective. I don't think many of us thought of it like that. Okay, I have one final question from Anish Rajan. Anish, go ahead.
Namaste. Good evening to our eminent panelists and distinguished moderators. And of course, good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all the viewers across the world. My question is to both Nirode, my good friend, and Aziz. I'm meeting you for the first time. Aziz, best wishes from Durban. India has a very large Indian diaspora around the world, 28 million, probably 30 million NRIs and persons of Indian origin. There's a very large African diaspora also around the world. And African countries, particularly South Africa, has very strong ties with the African diaspora, the black diaspora in US, UK, around the world. And I deeply admire government of South Africa's, ties with the diaspora around the world, and what we have done in the past as well to build African Indian solidarity across the world. So have you guys observed any similarities and the differences between the way in which India engages the Indian diaspora around the world and South Africa engages the African, the black diaspora around the world? And how can governments of India and South Africa work together to build a more genuine South-South, or I would say pan-Indian, pan-African global solidarity partnership? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Anish. I think from my side, I'd just like to set South Africa apart. During the years of isolation from India against the South African government, the South African Indian community became very resilient and independent, which is not necessarily a bad thing. Unlike other diasporic communities, perhaps in Kenya or Zambia or so forth, who kept the umbilical cord with India and visited often and sent money and imported priests and brides and so forth, the South African Indian was quite independent. And out of that independence, I think, has come a lot of strength. And uh, I would like to see the government of India, whilst it may have one eye on the Indian diaspora here, but engages with South Africa and Africa generally as their own sovereign states. That you have a great Indian community, or biggish sizable Indian community. The fact is that your engagement is with South Africa, and although Aziz and I are proud South Africans, I have Indian heritage, and but I still would play that card first. We fought to be South Africans. We fought for that vote, and I would like to be recognized as such. And I think what India is doing now is great, because unlike the British and the US Indian diaspora, where they have very strong business ties and still a lot of family that they go back and forth to, the South African Indian is very different, and I think that's not necessarily a bad thing.
I don't know if Aziz would like to say something, but before that, I think that's a point well taken. But I would also like to say that wherever you go around the world, generally speaking, the Indian community is a peaceful community and a well-respected community. And one of the reasons why that is so is because they are able to balance their Indian identity, which is a cultural identity, with their national identity as loyal citizens of their adopted homeland. And I think this balancing act has been done extremely well by Indians. Indians living in India, we respect members of the Indian diaspora as citizens of their own countries. And of course, we treat them as such. But that doesn't mean that we don't share a common cultural identity, which we should celebrate. That also doesn't mean that we should use these bridges, these existing connections to further contacts between the two countries, whether, as I mentioned, in business or in academia, or between our media, scholars, poets, scientists, etc. So I think, would Aziz like to say something?
No, I just want to say in the conclusion that I found this discussion very fruitful and fulfilling. And I want to thank you, Consul General, for having invited me and being in the company of my colleague here. And I want to congratulate you again to 75 years, and looking forward to the next 75. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. I wish to thank both our very distinguished and eloquent speakers for attending this seminar, for joining us and reflecting on all these important issues. The learning that I take away from this is that we must talk more to each other. I think both India and South Africa are established democracies, but like all democracies, they're works in progress. And I think there's much that we can learn from each other. Like I did today, some of the things that both of you said gave me new perspectives. So I think that there aren't enough conversations between our people, maybe on the business side, but between our scholars, thinkers, intellectuals, just not enough. And the proposal, for example, to have an institute for peace studies, and there are many other areas where I think both India and South Africa now have to look not to the Western world for succor, but to themselves, to emerging countries, to BRICS, to IPSA, and other such groupings. So I think with these words, I do hope that we will have similar occasions to discuss various other aspects. Today our discussions have ranged from cricket to peace. So there's a lot in between that. And I look forward to engaging with both of you, distinguished speakers today, and other South African intellectuals to discuss these important issues. I thank all participants for attending today. Namaskar.
Thank you.